Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today. I am Brother Marcus T. McCullough, and I'm a member of Theta Iota Lambda chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, seated right here in Springfield, Massachusetts. On behalf of all of our brothers in this chapter and beyond, thank you for taking a bit of time out of your day to join us for this first of what we hope to be many important conversations entitled The Concept of Progress. Today, we're talking about social justice. It's so important. Where have we been? Where are we now? And where are we going? And we're excited to welcome one of our brothers, Brother Rahshaan D. Hall, who will be our speaker today. Thank you for joining us. This is on Facebook Live, and some of our brothers are in the Zoom platform, and we appreciate you joining us again. To give some words of greeting, some words of remarks, we want to welcome our chapter president, my chapter president, Brother Jason Asarifi, who will greet us today.
Thank you, Brother McCullough. Such a warm greeting. Thank you to the brothers. First of all, thank you, Brother Rahshaan Hall, for joining us and taking time out of your busy schedule for, helping us host this program that I think is very important. Theta Iota Lambda has been serving the Springfield community since 1963. And many members of the chapter are esteemed members of the community, and we see there's issues in our community, right? But we also want to take action, and it's bigger than just Springfield; it's the country, as we've seen in the last 4 years. So thank you for having this conversation with us. Thank you for allowing us opportunity to learn, grow, and start thinking of some step forward. And also thank you to all you out there watching via Facebook or whatever other means you may be joining us with. Please feel free to engage, ask plenty of questions. We're here to all learn and grow together as a community. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brother President. Thank you for supporting this vision as well. One of our treasured poems for us as Alpha Brothers is Invictus, and we share this poem. It inspires us, it keeps us accountable, and it's something we share as brothers. And we are excited from one of our college brothers, a brother from Alpha Kappa, our brother Christoph, to come and present this poem at this time.
Perfect. Thank you, brothers. So I'll be reading Invictus by William Ernest Henley. Invictus. Out of night that covers me, black as a pit from pole to pole. I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell culture circumstance, I've not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody, but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears, looms but the horror of the shade. And yet the menace of the years finds that shall find me unafraid. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged punishment the scroll. I am the master of my fate and the captain of my soul. Invictus by William Ernest Henley.
Yes. Thank you, brother. Thank you so much. And again, we're cheering for you and all of our college brothers. And we expect great things to come from you. And we're so proud. Absolutely. So let's set this in a little bit of a broader context. Let's talk about why the concept of progress matters, not only to us as alphas, but really to all of us as members of the community and persons who really, really care about this effort and what we're doing. Our friend and brother Christian Cruz, will come now and talk about the concept of progress and why it's important for this discussion and future discussions to come. Brother Cruz.
Thank you, Brother McCullough, for passing it along to me. Thank you, brothers, for joining us this lovely afternoon, beautiful afternoon. Thank you, Brother Hall, for joining us and coming to join us as well. And thank you to all the folks out there on Facebook land who are joining us as well. Speaking about the history of progress and our fraternal ties to it, I don't think that it's a secret of the tumultuous times that we live in terms of what progress looks like for us, not only as a people, but as a nation in just the different times. In particular, one of our national programs, Voteless People is a Hopeless People, was enacted in the 1930s and started as a way and as a means to continue to provide enfranchisement for us as people. Brothers over the years, we have good brother Rahshaan Hall on the call with us now, but there's brothers all over who have been working towards the concept of progress, right? And what does that mean for us as a people? And how has Alpha been involved with that historically over the years? Different brothers, you have your Thurgood Marshalls, you have your CT Vivian, okay? You have obviously Brother Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Different brothers over the years who have contributed to this idea and to this concept of progress, right? Brother King directly led to the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1964. We know that different times and different things have allowed the disenfranchisement as us as a people. And to me, that is very key and paramount when you talk about progress, because we talk about stakeholdership in our communities and what does it mean for us to have a voice and what does it mean for us to be involved and to be able to promote this type of progress for us as a people. Progress means being able to vote without having to pay taxes at the poll, without having to pass a tax, without having to pass a test, without having to pass a quiz, without being questioned about the color of our skin. Progress means being able to have access to capital and to the different gains and to be able to start our Black Wall Streets and to do so without the fear of being intimidated or hunted down, right? Progress means being able to not feel the sense of anxiety or jolt that goes through us whenever we see those red and blue lights turn on behind us. And it may have been something as simple as accidentally running through a stop sign. So clearly, we all watch the news. We've all seen the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And we know that there is a lot more progress to be made as a people. And I'm glad Brother Hall is on the call to join us for us to be able to discuss that a little bit more and to speak about the history of us as a marginalized people, Black people, people of color, and where we've come from and where we're going and where we're headed and what can we do to continue to ensure that progress is being made. And not to sound too pessimistic, we have come a long way and things have gotten better for sure, but there's still work to be done. So I thank the good brother for joining us, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. And we will be monitoring the Facebook Live if questions arise as the discussion goes on, to be able to make that conversation. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Brother Cruz, for that. We know that this is such an important conversation for so many reasons. And as he said, we have come a ways, but there is still a ways to go. And so we are talking about that today. And really, our goal, one of our goals behind this program was to leave today feeling like we have something we can take on. We have something we can tackle, a place we can plant our flag as Alphas in Springfield and beyond. And so I want to take a moment and introduce the brother who will be our keynote speaker today, a dear friend and brother of mine, Brother Rahshaan D. Hall. He is the director of the Racial Justice Program for the American Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts. And in this role, he helps develop the ACLU of Massachusetts integrated advocacy approach to address racial justice issues. Through legislative advocacy, litigation, and community engagement, the program works on issues that deeply impact communities of color and historically disenfranchised communities. He also manages, and this is huge, he manages the ACLU of Massachusetts' What a Difference a DA Makes campaign. If you have not heard about this campaign, it is so important. Essentially, briefly, and Brother Rahshaan could tell me if I'm off, this campaign has talked about how important it is to discuss how district attorneys are selected. District attorneys work with police officers and bring charges against law enforcement and others. And so this campaign really pushes to look at district attorneys and how they're selected and how they're held accountable. And he spearheads that campaign, and it's been a wonderful job. He's such an experienced lawyer, particularly in civil rights and economic justice. He knows about policy, he knows about advocacy. He's worked with voting rights projects and litigation. He has even, along with other members of his team, challenged the previous presidential administration on some matters pertaining to rights and justice. He's a graduate of The Ohio State University, where he got his Bachelor of Arts. He went to Northeastern University School of Law for his JD, and he's a preacher. He went to Andover Newton School of Theology and got his MDiv. While a student at the Ohio State University, he joined our illustrious fraternity in the spring of 1992 through the Kappa chapter. And I believe he was the tail on his line. So he knows about being a brother. He is also a preacher in the AME Church and a member of the ministerial staff at St. Paul AME. This is a brother that is a dear friend, a dear brother, someone I'm incredibly proud of. I am excited to hear what he offers to us today. So brothers, let us please welcome and we extend gratitude to and for our keynote speaker, Brother Reverend Rahshaan David Hall. All right.
Thank you so much, Brother McCullough. I appreciate you. Thank you for that kind introduction. One of my favorite Reverend brothers in Christ. And whenever I need to lean in the shield when I'm out in the western land of Massachusetts, I know who to call. Thank you for your example and ministerial leadership, but also the way that you continue to march onward and upward toward the light. And to President Asifi, I appreciate the invitation and for the work that you are leading there in the greater Springfield area, and to the brothers of Theta Iota Lambda. It is my privilege to be before you today to talk about this concept of progress as it relates to our beloved fraternity, but also to our struggle as Black men and the larger struggle of the Black community for the conscience and sake of this nation. As I'm sure many of you all have seen, that over the last several years that there have been buildings burning in America, but buildings can be replaced. Black lives cannot. We're at this critical juncture in our nation's history where the confluence of oppressive events has revealed to some and affirmed for many the deep roots of systemic oppression and racism. We can't think about the murder of George Floyd without being reminded of Eric Garner. We can't think of the execution of Breonna Taylor without thinking of a Tatiana Jefferson. We cannot think about the vigilantism that snuffed out the life of Ahmaud Arbery without thinking of Trayvon Martin or Emmett Till or the countless nameless Black men and women who have been the victims of extrajudicial killings based on the spurious allegations of white folks. Whether it was Carolyn Bryant, the accuser of Emmett Till, or Sarah Page, the alleged victim of an assault that led to the Tulsa massacre, the vulnerability of Black life has always been central to the American narrative. That's why the actions of Amy Cooper, that white woman in Central Park in New York, were responded to with such anger. Her feigned pleas for help were the talismanic trigger that invoked the American narrative that could have ended so deadly. But let's not be confused about the source of this vulnerability or the scope of the narrative. The racial injustices being protested across the country are not only focused on the extrajudicial killings of unarmed Black people, the protests that have erupted throughout the nation have been the results of generations of unheard demands for justice. America has failed to hear how racial injustice is not only police killings, which we have been protesting against for generations, but it's the racially disparate COVID-19 death rates, the racially disparate vaccination deployment, educational gaps that are now exacerbated by the technology gap, gentrification in our communities, economic and wealth disparities, and environmental racism. These conditions in communities of color and in Black communities in particular are the direct result of centuries of structural racism and white supremacy. These, as Reverend Brother Dr. King said, these contingent and intolerable conditions, as he referred to them, are exacerbated by the lack of leadership in our nation. Many in the past had looked to the highest office in the land for a sober and resolute indicator of a path forward, but had been left wanting. And even now that there is a new presidential administration in place, we know that that administration ain't gonna save us. For some of us, we have always known that, as Audre Lorde says, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. But for the rest of us, there is a reckoning and hopefully an awakening to a reality that the injustices we see are not isolated incidents. They are embers from a flame that must be extinguished before they consume any more Black lives. And so part of the way that we extinguish the flames of racial injustice in this nation is through recognizing the ways that our society and the structures that maintain our society and the judicial system are complicit in maintaining an unjust social order. We cannot act as if the social construction of race has not created a racial hierarchy in which white people are at the top and Black and indigenous folks and other people of color are at the bottom. This nation's original sin of slavery serves as the cornerstone for racial capitalism upon which this nation's wealth and power have been built. Denying the humanity of our people has not only perpetuated the legacy of oppression, but has been facilitated by codified laws and statutory interpretation and academic instruction and law enforcement procedures and economic incentives and litigation that treats the law as if it is objective and or apolitical. It's not until we take into account the ways in which society interacts with race that we will see the dramatic shifts in racial equality that we so desire. It's not until we account for how the practice of institutions are informed by the racialized concepts of entire communities that we will reap the benefits of the constitutional guarantees of the equal protection of the laws. And this is something that has existed in our nation since its inception, since we were brought here in change, and even since emancipation. There is this seamless or uninterrupted thread that runs from this nation's history in slavery up through mass incarceration. There's been plenty of scholarship, and I don't need to recite it all, but just to give a brief conceptualization of the timeline from the moment of emancipation, when nearly 40 million enslaved Africans were released out into the world with no type of resources and no type of support, left to fend for themselves. The Reconstruction era tried to put in place some sort of system and structure that could repair some of the harm and the disadvantage that had been created by slavery. But shortly after that, in the post-Reconstruction era, Southern rights as a form of social control began to be engaged in vigilantism to control the masses of Black people who were in need. You see the rise of the Klan, but you also see the rise of a legal order, the creation of Black codes that criminalize Black conduct, anti-miscegenation laws, anti-vagrancy laws, trespassing laws, requirements that people had to be employed. This was a way of retaining or regaining that social order. And we see from that the convict leasing area that was driven by Southern landowners who wanted to continue to work their land and gain a profit. And so taking those who had been criminalized and incarcerated, then they were leased out to these very plantations. And in 1896, we see the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, which codifies or makes a part of the law, rather, this notion of separate but equal. Interestingly enough, this legal concept of separate but equal comes from good old liberal Massachusetts, where there was a Black man who sued to have his daughter go to the nearest school to her, as opposed to being forced to go to the colored school, which was on the other side of Beacon Hill, where the Black people lived back in the day. And it was the state's Supreme Judicial Court that said, well, we can't force her. We're not going to force her to go into this white school that's only a few blocks from her home, because there's a separate school for colored children, and therefore separate is equal. And then that was taken up by the United States Supreme Court in the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, which became the law of the land, initiating the Jim Crow era, where there was legal segregation in education and in housing and in healthcare and in home ownership and in economic opportunities. And the ability to be free from violence was contained and constrained by this notion of separate but equal under the Jim Crow era. But Jim wasn't alone. He had an uncle named Sam. When we think about the 1930 Social Security Administration Act, and because of a compromise that was made with Southern legislators, there were a huge swath of people who were excluded from that, and that was Black agricultural laborers and domestic workers. That was one way that kept Black people from generating wealth, because when you think about who were a majority of the laborers in the South, that's who it was. And when you think about the benefit of Social Security benefits to a family, not having to provide for and care for an elderly family member who no longer is physically able to work, that whole family unit is deprived of that additional wealth. When we think about the GI Bill, that was one of the largest drivers of wealth in this country. Black soldiers who put their lives on the line and served for this country were not able to come home and reap the same benefits of the GI Bill as their white counterparts, because of redlining, because of racialized segregation in housing. They couldn't get a federally backed home loan because the only communities that they were allowed to live in were communities that had been redlined by the federal government to say, we're not granting or backing any mortgages that are issued in these communities. And it's not like they could have gone out and purchased home in other communities in certain locations where the communities had been redlined. And the benefit of educational opportunities was excluded. They were excluded from because of segregation in schooling. So for those who had the opportunities to go to historically Black colleges and universities, some of the soldiers found that those institutions were oversubscribed. And so that largest driver of wealth kind of left them out. And there was the great unrest that was growing in major urban centers. And the Johnson administration in the 60s attempted to address it through the war on poverty, taking a social service approach to addressing the unrest and the disenfranchisement and the poverty in communities. But as the 60s revealed the level of uprising and protest in Black communities in particular, there was a pivot or a shift of the administration to make greater investment into the war on crime. And it is at that point in the mid-60s where we see this build out of a more robust carceral state. And what I mean by that is that there was greater investment in policing and specialized tactics and specialized units in policing. There was a greater investment in juvenile justice system. There were more laws put on the books to criminalize conduct and behavior. Mandatory minimums were introduced, and a greater investment in hiring prosecutors. So by the time that we reached the end of the Nixon era's war on drugs and into the beginning of the Reagan era war on drugs, the carceral infrastructure was built out in such a robust fashion that it was just set up for Black people to be funneled into. And we see the quadrupling of the prison population over a period of years, to the point where now the United States is 5% of the world's population, but we make up 25% of the world's prison population. But don't be confused. It's not as if Black people and other people of color sat along passively and allowed these things to happen. We were struggling and fighting and resisting and protesting every step of the way, but it is a constant reminder that progress is never linear. When we think about the Reconstruction period, that was the period of time where there were some of the first Black elected officials in the South. But the pendulum always swings back. You think of the Civil Rights Movement in the 50s and 60s and the progress that had been made through the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 and the Fair Housing Act of 68, but the pendulum swung back. And you see greater privatization and fewer resources afforded to our communities. You see the election of the nation's first Black president in the Obama administration, but the pendulum swings back. And you see the Trump administration and the rise of the right and the alt-right and white nationalism taking full and center stage. We have always been a part of the struggle, whether it was through the NAACP, whether it was through the National League of Negro Women, whether it was through our beloved fraternity or any of the other Divine Nine or the Urban League or the Council on Racial Equality. There have always been resistance movements, whether progressive, moderate, radical. We've been in this fight and we need to continue to be in this fight. We cannot simply allow the structures of this nation to be the salvation that we seek. We cannot continue to look to the courts as the panacea or the silver bullet that is going to extricate us from the mire of the maladies that afflict us. I'm reminded of a recent case in Massachusetts in 2016, Commonwealth v. Warren, where the police respond to a report of a burglary and they chase a young man who they believe fits the description, who was about a mile away from the report of the crime. And the court ruled that when the police said, hey, you stop, that they had seized him and that there had been an unjust seizure of that individual. And in the ruling, a Black judge on the state Supreme Court, not Springfield's own Roderick Ireland, but Justice Geraldine Hines, wrote when talking about his flight and whether or not that was enough to detain him for the police. She said, such an individual, when approached by the police, might just as easily be motivated by the desires to avoid the recurring indignity of being racially profiled as much as by the desire to hide criminal activity. And the reason that she was able to arrive at that point is because there was a report that the American Civil Liberties of Massachusetts issued in 2014 that talked about the racial disparities in police stops in the city of Boston, entitled Black, Brown, and Targeted. And what it showed is that even though Black people only made up 24% of the city of Boston's population, we made up 63% of the people who were stopped, frisked, interrogated, or observed by the police. And even after controlling for crime, and even after controlling for an individual's alleged criminal activity, there were still significant disparities. Black people were still 8 times more likely to be stopped, observed, or surveilled by the police. They looked at similarly situated communities, one Black, one white, with comparable crime rates, and they saw a higher rate of stops, frisk, interrogation, and observations of Black people in the Black communities than they did in the white communities. So it speaks volumes, but the way that we generated that report was based on the advocacy of people in the community who long since before they came to us back in 2010 or 2008, had been advocating and pushing for reforms in the way that policing was happening in the city of Boston, going back even to the days of Carol DeMatteis Stewart, when she was killed by her husband, Chuck Stewart, and Boston police rolled through the sections of Roxbury and Dorchester, putting Black children up against the walls and making them strip search in front of the public. There's always been that consistent push, and there's always been that consistent demand for equality and equal treatment under the law. But the law in and of itself is not going to save us. That's one opinion by one Black justice who no longer sits on that court. There's the very nature of this system, this legal system, is one that is rooted in racial injustice. I'm reminded of the Supreme Court case McCleskey v. Kemp, where a Black man tried to challenge his death sentence in the state of Georgia because he looked at all of the sentences, the people who had received life sentences, and the people overwhelmingly who had been accused of killing a white person were more likely to receive a death sentence. And he challenged this under the equal protection of the law. And the court, in its ruling, said McCleskey's claim, taken to its logical conclusion, throws into serious question the principles that underlie our entire criminal justice system. This is the thing that we are fighting against, the very roots and foundation of this system. This is a thing that our dear brother Thurgood Marshall was fighting against when he sought a legal challenge to desegregate schools, social engineering to find the challenges to use the very Constitution to break away at the foundation of structural racism in this community. But again, progress is never linear, and that's why we need to continue to be engaged. We had the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and it was renewed after 5 years, and renewed again after another 5 years, and renewed again after another 5 years. And then finally, the legislature said, you know what, we need to renew it for like another 20 years. And then they had another hearing in the late 90s and said, you know what, we need to renew it for another 20 years. But somewhere along the way, before it was able to be renewed again, the case Shelby County versus Eric Holder went up to the Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Roberts, and the Voting Rights Act was gutted. Section 3, which required pre-clearance, was essentially ruled unjust because the tool or the formula that was used to evaluate which jurisdictions would have to receive pre-clearance before they made any changes to voting rules or locations. He said, how can we rely and punish jurisdictions on on a formula that was created in the 60s. Mississippi, which is one of the jurisdictions that remains under that rule, has better voter registration outcomes of Black people than Massachusetts. It's just not fair to continue to have them bound by this rule. So it's unjust and we're going to throw it out. And so now you see a rise of changes in voting rules, state after state, particularly in states where there was a significant increase after the first Obama election of Black turnout. Republican-led legislatures enacted a whole host of voting rights restrictions, shortening early voting, shortening mail-in or creating voter identification requirements, eliminating voting locations in the immediate aftermath of this Shelby v. Holder decision. The law in and of itself will not change it. And even though this perpetual fight for justice continues, there are folks within the system who are trying to put forward the contradictions that lie within. I'm reminded of this recent case, Jameson v. McClendon, where District Court Judge Carlton Reeves out of Mississippi, there are 19 footnotes in the opening of his opinion in the court about Clarence Jameson, who was suing a police officer for pulling him over and detaining him for over 2 hours while he unjustly searched his car. And so he sued him for a violation of his rights. And Judge Reeves starts his opinion out by saying Clarence Jameson wasn't jaywalking. He wasn't outside playing with a toy gun. He didn't look like a suspicious person. He wasn't suspected of selling loose, untaxed cigarettes. He wasn't suspected of passing a counterfeit $20 bill. He didn't look like anyone suspected of a crime. He wasn't mentally ill and in need of help. He wasn't assisting an autistic patient who had wandered away from a group home. He wasn't walking from home from an after-school job. He wasn't walking back from a restaurant. He wasn't hanging out on a college campus. He wasn't standing outside of his apartment. He wasn't inside his apartment eating ice cream. He wasn't sleeping in his bed. He wasn't sleeping in his car. He didn't make an improper lane change. He didn't have a broken tail light. He wasn't driving over the speed limit. He wasn't driving under the speed limit. No, Clarence Jameson was a Black man driving a Mercedes convertible. And for each of those 19 things that he wasn't doing, there was a footnote that corresponded to an incident that we know from a headline, whether it was Botham Jean or George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Sandra Bland or Tamir Rice or Michael Brown. This list of all of the cases where police had taken the lives of Black people were all incidents where law enforcement had been protected from civil liability because of this doctrine of qualified immunity. So if it didn't apply to any of those cases, how would it apply to a Black man who just got pulled over for driving a Mercedes? And so the fight, the struggle continues, whether it's to push back on the attempted secession, the siege on the nation's capital, whether it's to stop gentrification in our communities, whether it's to have greater equity and academic access in our schools, in our community, whether it's to stop the flow of Black and brown people into our criminal legal system, whether it is to stop the abuse of the police departments. There is so much work that needs to continue to be done because progress is not linear. We must always be engaged in the fight. And we have to know that every fight that we are engaged in is building off of the products and the progress of those who had come before us. I recently read Mel King's book, Chain of Change. And essentially he tells the story of progress and activism and organizing in Black Boston that led to some of the significant impasses. We look at the corridor where the Orange Line runs through, the Southeast Corridor. That was where I-95 was supposed to run. But because of organizing by Black people, they stopped it there. And the organizing of Black and poor people and other people of color that time was inspired by educational advocacy that they had done earlier. And it had been inspired by other advocacy that they had done earlier before that. And so when I'm thinking about some of the most recent advocacy that we had been engaged in on the police reform bill, the coalition of organizations that came together to push for that police reform bill was a coalition that had come together 2 years earlier because of a criminal law reform bill, which is a part of the same coalition that had come together 5 years earlier on an attempt to block a 3 strikes bill. And so the concept of progress is one that contemplates the notion that progress is never linear and that we must continue to stay engaged. And so in closing, I am reminded of our history book that recounts in this particular chapter, I believe the 53rd General Conference and the Constitution Committee had recommended that in referring to the problem of civil rights, the adoption of the following statement, and it reads, "In light of this statement, our Constitution is colorblind, and the so eloquently put ideas of Brother Thurgood Marshall and Charles H. Wesley that every alpha man, both on the individual level and chapter level, make the federal Constitution a living reality, specifically in equal education opportunities, in equal employment opportunities, and in any other area in which there are existing inequalities. In essence, we recommend that Alpha stand unequivocally opposed to racial segregation in any form. We want no more than any other American, and we demand no less. To make this a reality, we further recommend that Alpha men keep in touch with and participate in projects in the local, state, and national legislatures on all matters pertaining to full and equal participation of all ethnic groups." And so I posit to you, dear brothers, what is the role of Alpha moving forward in light of this notion of the intractability of the push to oppose our progress? What is the role that we are to take up? What is the charge that we have that we must keep? I submit to you that there are 3 things that we must do. First, it is to get engaged in local politics. We've got to support legislative reform efforts. It's not lost on me that one of you all's state representatives, Carlos Gonzalez, last year was the chair of the Black and Latino Legislative Caucus that had a very pronounced role in the police reform legislation. He was also on the conference committee that helped craft that police reform legislation, but he was also someone who was a staunch opponent, maybe not a staunch opponent, but he wasn't helping reform the doctrine of qualified immunity at the state level, and we didn't win that. And here's somebody with an outsized level of influence in those negotiations who's from Springfield. Where was Theta Iota Lambda chapter when those bills were being negotiated to put pressure on Carlos Gonzalez? We've got to be engaged in these initiatives for legislative reform. We've got to be engaged in supporting candidates who are running for office. We've got to run for office. So the first thing is we've got to get engaged in local politics. The second thing is that we've got to use the platform, the influence, and the resources to educate the public. Even if you're not the experts on a particular issue, y'all know somebody. You know somebody who knows somebody. Maybe you're not an expert on environmental racism, but I bet you what, at least 3 of y'all can make a phone call to find somebody who can get out here and get on Zoom and talk about the impacts of environmental racism. You can find somebody who can talk about the educational disparities or the school to prison pipeline or the policing injustice that happens. The Bill Barr Department of Justice looked into one police department over the 4 years of the Trump administration and issued a report, and that was the Springfield Police Department. And you mean to tell me we can't find anybody to come out and talk, that y'all can't create a platform to discuss this, to educate and engage the public on? Most certainly you can. So first, get engaged in local politics. Second, use your platform and influence and resources to educate the public. And finally, work collaboratively with the grassroots organizers who are on the front lines, the people who are doing the work with their sleeves rolled up, the brothers and sisters who are working at the NAACP, at Pioneer Valley Project, at Neighbor to Neighbor, at any number of organizations who are doing the organizing, who are in the trenches, who are talking to the people. Those are the ways of engagement. That is the level of connectivity that must exist in the advocacy that we are engaged in. Moving forward, we have to continue to lift up the aims of our dear fraternity. Thank you, brothers.
Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Brother Hall. There are so many brothers clapping. I'm going to use the Zoom feature here and do a little clap myself. So rich, so much that you have said. And we want to provide an opportunity for brothers and also for those who may be tuning in on Facebook. We're, of course, glad you're with us. We want to provide an opportunity for a few minutes of question and answer. I've got 5 myself, but I don't want to be the one to start. There's so much that we can ask. So brothers, you can either use the raise your hand feature, or we're all brothers. We can be brotherly. You can unmute yourself and ask a question. And again, Facebook comments, we're looking for your questions as well. You can put questions in the chat if you find that appropriate. Let's keep this conversation going. And who's ready with the first question from Brother Hall? Brother Cruz, Brother Newland, anybody? I thought y'all were reaching.
No, yeah, I do. I do have a question. I definitely have a question. So, brother, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Brother Hall. That was wonderful. If you could give, because we have so many brothers here that work in education, could you give us your thoughts or recommendations on how we as a chapter can do a job engaging in that realm as well?
Education is always a challenging space because it involves people's children. And it also involves a lot of resources. And the tension that exists is, where do the resources come from to give our children what they need? And there is this long-lived effort to pit the interests of those most in need against the interest of the working class and vilify unions. And I think that's why we've seen a growth of charter institutions, because the narrative exists that we can't get rid of bad or problematic teachers because of unions. And that's just a false notion. I don't believe in that. And I think it's actually harmful. And when you think about it, the protections that teachers unions provide for the people who are responsible for educating our children are nominal compared to some of the things that they should have, but they're still out there fighting. And so I say all that as kind of prefacing and contextualizing this notion of educational advocacy as being rife with tension. That said, the more data that is available about academic success and as well as disciplinary issues are key. The more data that, and this is citywide, that is available about how resources are being expended is going to help in that advocacy. Because if we're spending an inordinate amount on policing, well, who is it that the police are policing? They're probably policing some of the people who the educational system has failed, right? And so we spend anywhere from, $50,000 to $60,000 a year to incarcerate someone, but we spend roughly $20,000 a year to educate a child in Massachusetts. But there's this cycle that exists, like we can never, whether it's defunding the police or drawing down resources from policing because we won't be safe. And with that mentality, we'll never be able to draw down those resources enough to invest in the things that we need. But I think advocacy around budget transparency, around performance data, and there's all kinds of studies, and I don't know what Springfield's particularly has done around this, but looking at discipline data and who's being disciplined, the racial disparities in discipline rates, but also the achievement gaps, and actually studying the conditions. One of my biggest problems, and this is this is part of the nonprofit industrial complex, is this deficit-based approach to analyzing our children, our communities. We'll look at all of the people who have failed or who have struggled and find out what are all of the indicators in their lives that are consistent to say, well, here's all the things that were consistently present in all of the lives of these children who dropped out of school or who didn't graduate, et cetera. But when is the investment in identifying the things that were present in the lives of the children who succeeded? Right? And let's use that strength-based model to then build out the resources that we need to make sure that all of our children are succeeding. And I think there needs to be a greater investment in creating a pipeline of Black and brown teachers, and especially male teachers. I think that our communities suffer because of the lack of the presence of men in our schools. Not to be on some old toxic masculinity, like men need to be in charge, but just like for young people to be able to relate and frame their understanding and concept of manhood based on people that they are in community with and see on a direct day-to-day level. So those are just a couple of my thoughts as it relates to education. I am curious though, do you all have an elected school board or is it appointed school board?
Our school committee in Springfield is, excuse me, it is elected.
Okay.
And it is elected based on, there are at-large seats, but then there are also
district seats.
Districts, yeah. So and it actually has become more diverse over the years. So it's a start.
and so again, that first point of getting engaged in local politics, who is on the school board? Who are we supporting as candidates for the school board? Who among us is running for these school committee seats and positions? Because, and this is one of the things that I despise about the way that the Black Lives Matter movement has been vilified, as if it is only kind of an anti-police organization. In reality, it's a pro-Black life organization that is trying to cast a vision of a world that we want to live in, where people's needs are being met. Right? We don't need to have police deal with our issues if people have homes, if people have quality education, if people have access to jobs and employment and have, counseling for the trauma that they've lived through, or substance use disorder treatment, or mental health resources, right? We don't need all the money to invest in policing to deal with those issues if people's underlying needs are met. And so similarly with education, if there are people who are advocating for greater resources to go to our children, we're going to get better outcomes. And so being engaged in those races and supporting those people is really going to make a difference.
Thank you so much, Brother Hall. I appreciate it.
That's a really important question. We have a number of educators in our chapter, and so that's something that we really, really thank you for that question, Brother Newland. Are there other questions from brothers at this time?
Yeah, I'll ask a question, Brother McCullough, if I may. First off, Brother Hall, thank you. I work in education myself, and I was a teacher before, so I'm here for the educational reforms and new ways to engage in education. Being out currently, I'm currently helping to volunteer with a campaign for city council right now, and I'm knocking on doors. And one of the things I've just noticed in the community is there is, I want to call it a lack of engagement, but a lack of hope and a lack of feeling like, knowing that who your candidates are and who's running for what office isn't important because things aren't going to change. What type of messaging would you suggest, and how would you suggest that we as a chapter and as a people engage the community in bringing forth the importance of being involved with the voting process, being involved with governance, and just taking that stakeholdership in the policies that govern us?
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic question, right? A voteless people is a hopeless people, but what if you ain't got nobody to vote for? Right? What is the point of connectivity that people find in the candidates that are before them? Like, I'm a big fan of Justin Hurts, right? Who's out there doing great things in the Springfield City Council, and I'm pleased with the careers of Orlando Ramos and Adam Gomez. Like, they've done great things, and now they've moved up into the state legislature, and those things are great. But a core principle of organizing is like finding out what the people's needs are. We can't continue to take the approach that everybody understands that voting is this essential thing that we must be involved in, and so therefore when I come to knock on your door, you're going to understand implicitly the value and want to be a part of it. Why? What has it ever done for me? Right? And so it's engaging the community at the base level to find out, well, what are your needs? What are the things? What is the malady that afflicts you? And then let's talk about, well, let's do some power mapping and a landscape analysis. Well, you worried about the shooting down at the corner. Okay, well, who's involved in that? And what are the resources that are going to address that besides more cops, right? Or this street is so dark and people are hanging out on the corner. Well, how do we get streetlights on? Right? Or it's the quality of the education, and I'm concerned about my child's ability to succeed coming out of this educational system. Well, who's on the school committee, right? And what are the proposals that are before them, and what can we do as a community that can influence those people? And when people start making the connection between their daily needs and this political process, and have some small victories along the way, right? First, we get the pothole filled, then we get some lights on the street, and then we get some after school programs to engage the young people. Then we get fewer cops on the street because we've got some youth workers that are engaging with them. And then we're improving the educational system. So it just continues to build on itself, this chain of change. And so meeting people where they are and finding out what their needs are, and then helping them identify the connections, but also, and more importantly, a key function of organizing is helping them recognize and realize the power that they have to address those things. And then they coalesce around that power. And I think that's a key role that the chapter can play, is what are the forums where we can bring people together? What are the initiatives where we can go out into the community and do a community survey to find out what it is folks need? And then based on that, what are the resources that we have to connect to those people's needs and build around that?
Excellent. Brother Hall, I appreciate your answer. Thank you. Thank you.
Fantastic question. Yes, brother. Go ahead, Brother Christoph. I think you're raising your hand, Brother Zephyrin.
All right. Thank you, Brother Hall. And I had since I'm kind of representing the college community here, I had another question similar to Brother Cruz's, to kind of understand how we can also create those changes within college communities. Now, college communities are a little different because a big thing that stops us from really promoting ourselves as a Black community specifically is, a lot of times we don't trust that what we're voting for is actually going to create change. So I think that a big thing is where do you find those resources to show people yo, this is the actual change that you can create, right? And then how then do we give that to the college communities and let them experience that as well?
That's a great question, right? I mean, look, if it wasn't for eyes on the prize, I wouldn't have known what Black people before me had done, the extent to which they had made sacrifices and put their lives on the line, which led to, the aftermath of Bloody Sunday was the Voting Rights Act, because it had nationalized the struggle for suffrage for Black people. And so there are plenty of documentaries that show the history of Black struggle, but also Black progress. There are plenty of books, but I recognize folks aren't really trying to read a book. But there are a lot of grassroots organizations that are doing work in the community. I had mentioned Pioneer Valley Project as a partner that we regularly work with out in the Springfield area that are doing great work. And those folks in that organization know the history of struggle and also some of the successes that they've had. and they see, like, this saying that all politics is local is really true, because, everybody puts all their attention on the national presidential election and congressional elections, which is important. But we rarely experience the direct impacts of those things on a day-to-day level. But, who's at the school committee, who's at city council, who's in the state legislature, those are the day-to-day experiences or decisions that impact our daily experience. And so, finding the local advocates and activists who have been engaged in local struggles are the ones who are that's who you invite to talk to your group, to talk about the history of their work in that city, in that community, and what partnerships had existed in the past between the college campus and the folks in the community, because that's another key thing, right? There's often tension between the college community and the college campus and the surrounding community, and people, feeling at odds. I'm reminded of the scene from School Days at the Kentucky Fried Chicken, where the brothers from the neighborhood had beef with the brothers from the college, and it doesn't have to be that way. So I just think kind of look to the resources that exist, whether they are documentaries or films or books, but then also look to the human resources of the activists and advocates in the community who have been there for a long time doing the work to tell the story of struggle, but also progress.
Thank you, Brother Hall.
Absolutely. Great question. Great answer. Brothers, we do have some more time. If you've got questions, Facebook, if you have questions for us in the chat, we certainly want you to do that. Brother Hall, I'm going to dive in with one of the questions that I have. And I so appreciate the historical framing of this whole conversation. It is so interesting when you talk about separate but equal arising out of Massachusetts, a Massachusetts issue. It's so interesting, even when I lived in Boston, hearing that, the first Black school was in Boston on Beacon Hill. It's so interesting. I think sometimes too often when it comes to racial injustice, particularly with policing and whatever, people think the North is out of it or New England is out of it because we're so progressive and we're so educated. Can you talk a little bit more, flesh out a little bit more about some of the struggles particular to New England or particular to Massachusetts? And again, as always, maybe how folks like us in our chapter can recognize that, bring attention to it, and do something about it. I think it's so fascinating.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Malcolm X, who, said, y'all stop talking about the South. Everything south of the Canadian border is the South. And I think that's very real. A great book by Isabel Wilkerson, The Warmth of Other Sun, talks about the experience of Black people who fled the South, refugees from racial oppression, to northern cities, only to be met with white aggression in the North. And it's no different here in good old liberal New England. I like to say we suffer from liberal exceptionalism, because we were one of the first abolitionist states, or one of the first states to allow same-sex marriage, or one of the first states, or one of the states that regularly votes for the Democratic nominee in presidential elections, that we don't have issues of race and racism here in Massachusetts. But it's simply not the case, right? Even though Black and Latinx folks make up roughly 25% of the state's population, we make up 54% of the state's prison population. And then when you look at people who are serving mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses, that number jumps up to 75%. And this is in the face of evidence that shows that Black, white, and Latinos use and sell drugs at relatively comparable rates, right? But we make up 75% of the people who are serving mandatory minimum drug sentences. So it's not really about the South, or like they used to say, up South. I just did an interview with NBC. They did a study on arrests from different municipalities and over 10 years, and it showed that a majority of the states that they had data for had huge racial disparities in the arrest of Black people. And Cambridge had the worst racial disparities in arrest of Black people relative
Cambridge,
to
liberal Cambridge, Harvard Cambridge.
The People's Republic of Cambridge had some of the worst racial disparity, had the worst arrest disparity of Black people compared to their relative representation in the population. And I think that speaks volumes to the way that policing happens. The city of Boston just did an economic analysis, economic impact equity analysis that looked at municipal contracts and procurements by the city. And it was like 1.2% went to minority-owned businesses of city contracts, even though Black people make up 24% of the city of Boston's population, and Latinos make up like 23, I think, or something like that. And you mean to tell me that we only make up 1.12% of the contracts, and Black people, when you just look at Black businesses, only made up 0.4% of the business contracts? And when you think about the generation and creation of wealth, you know, and business opportunities in the community, a lot of municipal procurements help generate that. Look at Atlanta and the airport that was built. You know, the mayor, Brother Jackson, it's like, yeah, we're gonna put on Black construction crews and Black contractors to build out this airport, and we're gonna create a whole generation of business owners that can then be able to bid for the next round of municipal contracts that happen. But nobody has taken those specific steps. So, you know, so up south here, we have those problems. White liberals are, you know, people who believe in equity until it meets them at their doorstep, right? There's folks who got a Black Lives Matter sign in their yard, but yet they're holding on to an outdated, racially biased entrance exam process for Boston's prestigious exam school with a stranglehold, because they think their child is gonna have less of an opportunity, when the proposal to suspend the entrance exam for the prestigious exam schools for 1 year because of COVID, they filed a lawsuit. So, you know, just because people ain't running around with Confederate flags and calling you the N-word doesn't mean that racism doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean that people aren't racist, whether it is overtly racist because they're calling you names, or is because they intentionally support and maintain a system of white supremacy and white dominant culture. And those are the things that we have to continue to struggle against. And I think it's incumbent upon us in our personal capacity, but also in our organizational capacities, to create the space to have these conversations, to share the literature, to share the conversations, to engage in the work that helps dismantle these systems and structures of oppression, and continue to be that thorn in the side of those who are in positions of power, who say they have come to proclaim a message of liberalism, when in fact, sometimes it's neoliberalism.
Thank you. Wow. Wow, goodness. That's heavy. Thank you, thank you. Brother Shern has a question next. Brother Shern, if you will unmute yourself and offer your question.
Okay, well, actually, it's not specifically a question, but I want to, thank Brother Hall and Brother Cruz and Brother McCullough for bringing this forum to us. And as I said, it's not really a question, but it's, what do we do as a chapter? And I think that that from this discussion, that the chapter needs to consider setting aside either a committee of 1 or 2 people who actually bring issues to the chapter, so that we can actually develop an action plan relative to whatever the issue may be. Now, I've been in this chapter for over 30 years, and in the past, we had individual brothers that would bring issues from the community or the state to the chapter, and demand that the chapter put together an action plan. Specifically, brothers like Frank Button, who passed away, last year, and there was a few brothers, before him. But the chapter was dependent upon those individual brothers to bring the issue to the chapter. And I think that we're at a point now where things have changed, and we need to have some representation in our formal structure as a chapter to help us get those issues, one, on the table, and two, develop an action plan for those issues.
Thank you, Brother Sean. That's absolutely right. And that, I think every Alpha chapter needs that. Community clergy, we have that conversation. It is absolutely correct. We're almost out of time, but if there are other burning questions, I just have one question too.
Yeah, and just real quick, I just want to
Yeah, go ahead.
co-sign. I just want to co-sign what Brother Shern said. Like, there should be like a social justice committee within the chapter where there's, a responsibility. Legislative session in Massachusetts lasts 2 years. Bills just got filed February 19th. I'm sure there are plenty of bills that relate to questions of issues of import to the fraternity, to brothers in Springfield. The ACLU certainly has some of our priorities, but there are plenty of other organizations that have their legislative priorities listed. Now that all the bills have been filed, the chapter can find out who's doing the advocacy on those and develop a strategy. The session lasts 2 years. So it began in January, it ends July 30th of next year. So there will be hearings where they'll need testimony. And you know what? We absolutely need testimony from Western Mass, because a lot of the advocacy is Boston centric, as y'all know, right? But because the capital is in Boston, it's hard for folks to get out there. Now with the advent of Zoom, it's a game changer. And so when we have greater geographic representation in our advocacy, the legislators from Western Mass then understand that they have an obligation to deal with these bills that are before the respective committees and play an important role. Redistricting is coming up. This is where not only congressional districts are being redrawn, but local legislative districts are being redrawn. We need to increase representation within the legislature. There are only 16 Black and Latino elected officials in Massachusetts out of a total of 300, I think it is, or no, out of 200, right? And there's only 16 of us representing our interests. We need to make sure these districts are drawn in a way that we've got many more of us in that building advocating for our needs. So a committee whose responsibility is to find out what the policy needs are, find out what the grassroots advocates are advocating for, and bring that back to the chapter and have the chapter develop an approach to that is excellent. Thank you, Brother Sharon.
Yes, thank you. And Brother Hall, I would hope, of course, personally, we'll have many conversations because you're my boy. But
Yes,
in addition, whatever the ACLU is pushing, whatever is going on in Massachusetts, if you could just reach out to me, Brother Cruz, we would love to stay in touch and know what's going on. Because I do think, speaking of a lot of stuff that's Boston centric, sometimes we don't get all the details and all the information. So if we could just make sure that we keep in touch, and TIO will certainly find a place to plant our flag and continue to do the work as well.
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and drop our legislative priorities in the chat right now.
All right, he's dropping legislative priorities in the chat. Brothers, there is a link. We all need to go. We all need to take a look, and let's certainly find a place for us to do our work. If there are no other burning questions for this dynamic brother, certainly again, Brother Hall, my goodness gracious, man, you have really inspired us and informed us. And I want to thank you so much. You're getting praise from the brothers and certainly even love on Facebook as well. And just thank you so much for doing everything. Listen, you may be tuning in, and this may be your first time watching one of our conversations here at TIL. And believe me, more are coming. This is the first of many conversations that we will share with our community and with our brotherhood. This is an important work, and we do important work as the Theta Iota Lambda chapter here in the city of Springfield and in the surrounding area. We invite you to consider making a donation to our Lee B. Revels Scholarship and Mentorship Foundation. We take education very seriously in this chapter and in this fraternity, and it is important that we continue to support our young men of color who are making their educational pursuits to college. You know that we have historically had our oratorical competition, where we not only help young men present themselves and speak well, but we grant scholarships to help them go to college. And shout out, of course, to Brother Newland and everyone who's an educator in the chapter. So please go to springfieldalphas.com and consider making a donation to our scholarship foundation. If Cash App is easier for you, you can find us at #Springfield APA. Real simple, Springfield APA. We encourage you to donate to our scholarship foundation, and we're really, really grateful that you have joined us this afternoon. Brother President, do you have anything that you would like to add before we prepare to close out?
No, I think you said it all. Please be on the lookout for future programs from TIL, and please just join us whenever we do. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Brother President. Amen. Well, thank you, brothers. Thank you, TIL. Thank you for those again in the community who are joining us today. Again, Brother Hall, so thankful for you. And we probably will end up talking to you some more and getting counsel from you. And listen, this video is on Facebook Live, so that means you can go to the Springfield Alphas Facebook page and find this video. And we're going to continue to keep this conversation going. So on behalf of Brother Asarifi and Brother Newland and Brother Cruz and myself and our entire chapter, thank you again for joining us. And we look forward to having more conversation and taking action in the very near future. To close us in a word of prayer, we invite one of our brothers, Brother Reverend Dr. Atu White, to offer us some closing words and a prayer.
Let us pray. We're grateful for our time together. We thank you for Brother Rahshaan Hall. We thank you for his words as he encouraged and challenged us. We understand that progress is never linear. Progress requires us to be engaged and to use our platform, influence, and resources to educate our community. While we build collaborative connections with organizations that strive to build a better community, a better city, a better commonwealth, a better country, and a better world. It is our prayer that the true spirit of fraternity rule our hearts, guide our thoughts, and control our lives so that we may become through thee servants of all. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you very soon. God bless. Ice cold.